They called me a fat pig at my own son's wedding. What they didn't know was that I owned their entire world. My name is Barbara Sinclair. I'm 74 years old, and I've spent the last 5 decades building an $87 million fortune in Silicon Valley venture capital alongside my late husband Kenneth. In all those years, I learned one crucial lesson. The most powerful people in the room are often the ones nobody's paying attention to. The day my son Daniel married Vanessa Thornton should have been one of the happiest of my life. Instead, it became the day I realized that being underestimated for being old, for being overweight, for being a widow could be my greatest weapon. I was standing at the buffet line in my custom-made champagne dress, $20,000, because even at my age and size, I refused to apologize for taking up space when I heard my new daughter-in-law behind me. She was whispering to her bridesmaids, but these 74-year-old ears still work perfectly. "Look at that old whale stuffing her face," she hissed. "That fat pig is going to eat everything." I thought she'd have the decency not to show up looking like that. Her friends giggled. My face burned, but not with shame. With something far more dangerous, clarity. You see, 3 months before that wedding, I had quietly acquired 70% of Thornton Manufacturing, the mid-sized automotive parts company that Vanessa's pompous father Robert had built his entire family's arrogance upon. He had no idea that the anonymous investor who'd saved his company from bankruptcy was the same old whale his daughter was mocking over shrimp cocktail. This is the story of how I taught them both that age brings wisdom, wealth whispers louder than youth screams, and you should never, ever underestimate a grandmother who's spent 50 years eating men like them for breakfast. If you want to hear how a fat pig bought the whole farm and everyone in it, stay with me. You're going to enjoy this. I turned around with a smile, that Dotha kind of smile I'd perfected over decades of business dealings with men who thought a woman's opinion expired at menopause. "Vanessa, darling," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "You look absolutely stunning. Congratulations on your special day." She kissed my cheek with barely concealed disgust, her perfect 28-year-old nose wrinkling slightly as if my age was contagious. Then she swept away in that $15,000 dress, half of which Daniel had paid for because I'd taught my son to be generous, perhaps too generous. I sat down at my table, my chest tight. Not from hurt I'd survived far worse than a spoiled child's insults. Kenneth's death 6 years ago had taught me what real pain felt like. This was different. This was disrespect. The kind that comes from someone who thinks your life experience means nothing because your body doesn't fit their standards anymore. Daniel came over immediately, his handsome face creased with concern. He'd seen my expression shift. "Mom, are you okay? You look upset." I lied smoothly, another skill you perfect after 74 years on this earth. Told him I was just emotional, overwhelmed by seeing my only child get married. He bought it because he's a good man, the kind who assumes the best in people. I raised him that way. Sometimes I wonder if I did him a disservice. Throughout the reception, I watched Vanessa work the room like she owned it. She was glued to her father's side, Robert Thornton, this pompous 60-year-old man who wore his third-generation family manufacturing business like a crown. He'd given a toast earlier about legacy and tradition and building something that lasts, and the whole time he was speaking, I noticed how he looked at people, at the younger guests' approval, at successful-looking men interest, at women my age dismissal. When his eyes had passed over me during that speech, I'd seen it clearly. I was invisible to him, just the groom's elderly mother, probably widowed and living on whatever her husband had left her, taking up space at a table. If only he knew. After Kenneth passed, I'd taken over our investment portfolio completely. 50 years of watching him work, learning every strategy, sitting in on every meeting, even when the other men in the room acted like I was just there to serve coffee. By the time he died, I knew more about venture capital than most men half my age. Our fortune had grown from 12 million to 87 million under my management alone. And 3 months before this wedding, when Robert Thornton's company hit a liquidity crisis after losing a major contract, when he was desperate for capital and too proud to admit his legacy, business was circling the drain. I'd been there. Not openly, of course. I'd had my financial attorney, Philip Morrison, structure the acquisition through a network of trusts and LLCs, anonymous investor, clean paperwork. Robert got to keep his CEO title and his dignity. What he didn't get to keep was control. I owned him. I owned his company. I owned the source of every bit of arrogance that dripped from his daughter's entitled mouth. During the cake cutting, Vanessa whispered something to her cousin while looking directly at me. They both laughed, covering their mouths like teenagers. I was sitting alone at that moment. Daniel was talking to groomsmen, and the other parents at my table had gone to the bar. I looked down at my plate, at the small slice of wedding cake I'd allowed myself, and something hardened inside my chest. Kenneth used to tell me that the best business moves came from a place of absolute calm, not anger. He'd say that when you feel that initial rage, you step back, you breathe, you plan, then you strike with precision. I thought about Robert Thornton sitting in his office every Monday morning, reviewing reports, making decisions, feeling like the master of his domain. I thought about how he had no idea that every significant decision he made went through a board he'd never met aboard. I controlled completely through proxy votes. I thought about Vanessa, collecting $90,000 a year as a public relations consultant, while showing up twice a month for expensive lunches on the corporate card. I'd seen the audit reports. The girl did nothing except spend company money and brag about her family's business. And I thought about my son, my beautiful, kind boy who I'd raised to see the good in people. Now married to a woman who'd called his mother a fat pig on what should have been the happiest day of their lives. That's when I made my decision. On Monday morning, I called Philip Morrison. My hands weren't shaking. These hands had signed $100 million deals, held my dying husband's hand through his last breath, and typed out investment strategies that made grown men wealthy. They were steady as rocks. I told Philip I wanted an emergency board meeting at Thornton Manufacturing for Friday. And I told him something I'd never done in 3 months of silent ownership. I was going to attend in person. Philip tried to talk me out of it. At 74, I usually operated behind the scenes, letting younger faces be the ones in the room. Less questions that way. Less discrimination. It's amazing how much power you can wield when people don't know you're the one wielding it. But this time, I needed them to see me. I needed Robert Thornton to look into the eyes of the invisible old woman and realize exactly who'd been signing his paychecks. Friday arrived. I chose my outfit carefully: a navy Chanel suit, my silver hair styled impeccably by the same stylist who'd done my hair for 50 years, low heels because my feet aren't what they used to be, but my spine still stands straight. I carried my leather briefcase, the one Kenneth gave me on our 20th anniversary. Inside it, 50 years of business experience and complete documentation of every financial irregularity in the Thornton Manufacturing books. When I walked into that boardroom, Robert Thornton's face went through several shades of confusion. I watched him try to place me the wedding, his daughter's new mother-in-law. What was I doing here? I sat down at the head of the conference table. That's when recognition sparked in his eyes, followed immediately by indignation. He actually sputtered, told me there must be some mistake, that this was a private executive meeting, that I shouldn't be here. Philip Morrison smiled beside me, that shark smile that had negotiated 1,000 deals, and said the words I'd been waiting 3 months to hear spoken out loud. Mr. Thornton, I'd like to formally introduce Barbara Sinclair, majority owner of Thornton Manufacturing and chair of the board of directors. She's been your boss for 3 months. The silence in that room was the sweetest sound I'd heard since my wedding day 52 years ago. And that's when I opened my briefcase and began to dismantle his entire world, piece by careful piece. The look on Robert Thornton's face was something I'll treasure until my dying day. You have to understand, when you're a woman my age, people stop really seeing you. We become furniture, background noise, the grandmother at Thanksgiving, who everyone tolerates but nobody listens to. But in that moment, Robert was merely seeing me for the first time. He tried to recover, of course. Men like him always do. He cleared his throat and attempted that condescending tone that powerful men use when they think they can talk their way out of anything. He started explaining that there must be some confusion, that surely I didn't understand how the business worked, that perhaps my financial advisors had misrepresented the situation to me. I let him talk. Another thing you learn over 7 decades. Sometimes the best move is silence. Let them dig their own grave with their assumptions. When he finally ran out of steam, I opened my briefcase slowly, methodically, the way Kenneth taught me. Never rush when you hold all the cards. Inside were 3 folders, each one clouded blue for financial discrepancies, red for nepotism and hiring violations, yellow for personal misuse of company funds. I started with the blue folder. Robert, I said, my voice calm and professional, the same voice I'd used in 100 boardrooms where I was the only woman present. Let me show you exactly how well I understand your business. In the past 18 months, you've approved 7 separate consulting contracts to firms owned by your college fraternity brothers. These contracts total over $2 million. The work provided has been substandard at best, fraudulent at worst. One of these consulting firms doesn't even have an office address. It's a P.O. box in Delaware. I watched the color drain from his face as I slid the documentation across the table. Bank records, email trails, everything. But I was just getting started. I opened the red folder next. Your daughter Vanessa has been on the company payroll for 3 years as a public relations consultant, earning $90,000 annually. According to security logs, she's accessed the building an average of 2.3 times per month, always during lunch hours. According to corporate credit card records, she's spent over $40,000 of company money at restaurants, spas, and retail stores. I have receipts showing she used the company card to buy her wedding dress. Robert tried to interrupt, started saying something about family businesses and grooming the next generation. I held up one hand, these old hands that he probably thought were only good for knitting, and he actually stopped talking. I'm not finished, I said quietly. And that's when I opened the yellow folder. This was the one that would hurt. This was the one I'd debated about whether to use, because it crossed from business into personal territory. But then I remembered standing at that buffet line, hearing myself called a fat pig. And I decided that personal was exactly where this needed to go. The wedding, I said, meeting his eyes directly. Your daughter's wedding to my son. The venue, the catering, the flowers, the band $143,000. All of it charged to Thornton Manufacturing and classified as a corporate event for tax purposes. That's not just unethical, Robert. That's fraud. That's the kind of thing that gets CFOs sent to federal prison. The room went absolutely silent. Even Philip looked a bit surprised. I hadn't told him I was going to lead with this. Robert's face went from pale to red. He started blustering about how it was partially a corporate event, how business associates were invited, how it was good for company morale and client relations. I let him finish. Then I said something that came from 5 decades of watching powerful men justify their bad behavior. Robert, I've been in business since before you were born. I've seen every trick, every excuse, every creative accounting method that exists. And I'm telling you right now, what you did was steal from your own company to pay for your daughter's party. And that company belongs to me now. That's when he made his first real mistake. He got angry, not defensive angry, but entitled angry, the kind of anger that comes from a man who's never had to answer to anyone, especially not to a woman, and definitely not to a woman my age. He stood up, put his hands on the table, and leaned toward me in what I suppose he thought was an intimidating posture. He told me that I might own the majority shares, but I didn't understand the manufacturing business, that I couldn't just walk in and destroy everything he'd built, that his family had been running this company for 3 generations and it would continue running his way. I didn't need to. I just looked up at him calmly and said what needed to be said. Sit down, Robert, or clean out your desk. Your choice. He sat. What happened next took 2 hours. But I'll give you the summary, because the details would bore you, and I didn't become a successful investor by boring people. I laid out my terms, one by one, like a surgeon making careful incisions. Vanessa would be terminated immediately. No severance, no farewell party, no glowing recommendation letter. Just gone. Robert would remain as CEO. I'm not cruel enough to take away a man's life's work entirely, but his compensation would be reduced by 40% until the company returned to profitability. And every decision over $10,000 would require my written approval. The fraternity brother consulting contracts would be canceled immediately. I'd already identified legitimate firms to replace them at half the cost. And the big one. Robert would personally repay the $143,000 he'd stolen from company funds for the wedding. He had 30 days to write that check, or I would file criminal charges. Philip, bless him, handed over the paperwork. Everything already drawn up, just waiting for signatures. That's the thing about good lawyers, they know how to prepare for the kill shot. Robert tried one more time to negotiate, said he'd resign before he'd accept these terms, said I couldn't run the company without him, that I was just a bitter old woman taking out personal grudges in a professional setting. That's when I smiled. not a friendly smile. The smile I used to give Kenneth's business rivals right before we crushed them. You have a personal loan of $500,000 secured against the shares you sold me, I said softly, shares that I now control. If you resign, I'll call that loan immediately. You'll be bankrupt within 60 days. You'll lose your house, your cars, your country club membership, everything you've built your identity on. And you know what's even better, Robert? I'll still own this company, and I'll hire someone younger, sharper, and cheaper to run it. Someone who won't steal from me to fund their daughter's fairy tale wedding. I watched him realize he was trapped. Completely, totally trapped. It's not a nice feeling, I'm sure. I've been trapped before by grief when Kenneth died. By society's expectations of what an old widow should do with herself. By my own son's belief that Vanessa was the love of his life. Being trapped makes you feel small and helpless. I wanted Robert Thornton to know exactly how that felt. He signed the papers. All of them. His hand was shaking slightly. Noticed because I've signed enough contracts to recognize the tremor of a man who knows he's lost everything. When we finished, I stood up slowly because 74-year-old knees don't move as fast as they used to, and I gathered my folders back into my briefcase. Before I left, I turned back to him one more time. One more thing, Robert, I said. Your daughter called me a fat pig at her wedding. She thought I couldn't hear her. Or maybe she just didn't care. Either way, she's about to learn something important. This fat pig just bought the whole farm. I walked out of that boardroom with my head high. Philip followed me, trying not to laugh. In the elevator, once we were alone, he finally let it out. Told me that was the most ruthless business move he'd seen in 30 years of corporate law. I didn't feel ruthless. I felt clear. Like I'd finally stopped pretending that being nice and being respected were the same thing. But as I drove home that afternoon, my hands finally started shaking on the steering wheel. Not from fear or regret, from the realization that I'd only scratched the surface. The wedding fraud, the nepotism, the consulting contracts, those were just the obvious problems. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went through every single document Philip had compiled during the acquisition process. Bank statements, tax returns, employment records, emails that had been preserved during discovery. I spent 3 days in my home office, the same office where Kenneth and I used to plan our investment strategies, looking for patterns, and that's when I found it. Hidden in a subsidiary account, there were regular monthly transfers to an LLC called Thornton Consulting Services. $20,000 every single month for the past 4 years. Almost $1 million total. The LLC was registered in Nevada State, famous for corporate secrecy, and the paperwork listed Robert as the sole owner. I pulled up the corporate tax returns. Thornton Consulting Services had reported minimal income, which meant Robert was siphoning money from his own company into a private account and not paying taxes on it. This wasn't just wedding fraud. This was systematic theft. And it had been going on for years. My heart was pounding as I traced the money further. Some of it went to a property in Aspen, a vacation home, that wasn't listed in any of Robert's personal asset disclosures. Some of it went to private school tuition for his grandchildren. And a significant chunk, over $200,000, had been spent at luxury retailers and restaurants. Robert Thornton had been treating his company like a personal piggy bank for years, and now I owned that piggy bank. I called Philip at home on Sunday evening. Told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a long moment, then asked me what I wanted to do. That was the question, wasn't it? I could destroy Robert completely. Tax evasion, fraud, embezzlement. The man would go to prison. His family would lose everything. Vanessa would go from princess to pauper overnight. Part of me, the part that still remembered being called a fat pig, wanted exactly that. But another part of me, the part that had been married to Kenneth for 46 years and learned that revenge without strategy is just cruelty, knew there was a smarter play. We hold on to this, I told Philip. We document everything. We have it ready, but we don't use it yet. This is our insurance policy. If Robert steps out of line even once, if Vanessa tries anything against Daniel, if that family makes one more move against mine, then we burn their entire world down. Philip agreed. Said it was the smart move. Said Kenneth would have been proud. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how close I'd come to just being the nice grandmother, the one who swallowed the insult and smiled through the wedding and never said a word. How many women my age do exactly that? How many times are we taught that dignity means silence, that grace means accepting disrespect. I got out of bed around 3 in the morning and went to my office, pulled out an old photo album, one of the few physical things I kept after Kenneth died. There was a picture from 1973, me at 22, on the day Kenneth and I closed our first major investment deal. I was wearing a ridiculous orange dress that was fashionable then. My hair was dark brown, and I probably weighed 120 pounds soaking wet. I looked at that young woman and wondered what she would think of me now. Older, heavier, widowed, sitting alone in a house that used to ring with family dinners and laughter. Then, I looked at the boardroom photo from last Friday. Philip had taken it for the records, showing me signing the new corporate governance documents for Thornton Manufacturing. Same woman, 50 years later, different dress size, different hair color, different life, but the same sharp eyes, the same steady hands, the same brain that had turned 12 million into 87 million. Vanessa Thornton had looked at the photo on the left and seen only what she wanted to see, an old, fat woman taking up space. She never saw the photo on the right, a woman who owned her father's entire world. They thought my age made me weak. They were about to learn that it made me dangerous. The hardest part wasn't confronting Robert Thornton in that boardroom. The hardest part was what came after, pretending nothing had changed. You see, I hadn't told Daniel yet. My son had no idea that I'd just taken control of his father-in-law's company, that I'd discovered years of fraud, or that his new wife had been stealing from her own family business. And I needed to keep it that way, at least for a little while longer. Because here's what 74 years teaches you. People reveal their true selves when they think they're winning. The Sunday after that boardroom meeting, Daniel and Vanessa came over for dinner. It was supposed to be a post-wedding celebration, just the three of us. Since they'd postponed their honeymoon until the fall, I'd made pot roast, Daniel's favorite since he was 5 years old, and set the dining room table with my good china. Vanessa walked into my home like she was touring a museum of outdated things. I watched her eyes sweep over my furniture, the photos of Kenneth on the mantel, the needlepoint pillows I'd made decades ago. Her lip curled slightly. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. Her body language screamed that she found my entire life quaint and sad. "Mrs. Sinclair," she said, "never Barbara, always the formal distance. Thank you for having us. Though I told Danny we should really take you out to dinner instead of making you cook at your age." At my age, as if 74 meant I was 1 foot in the grave, incapable of operating a stove. I smiled sweetly. "Oh, it's no trouble at all, dear. I enjoy cooking. Keeps these old hands busy." Daniel hugged me, apologized for Vanessa, said she was just worried about me overdoing it. My beautiful, kind boy, always making excuses for the people he loved. During dinner, Vanessa barely touched her food. She pushed the pot roast around her plate and made a comment about how she and Daniel were trying to eat cleaner, more modern cuisine. Then she looked at me pointedly and said that comfort food was probably fine for my generation, but that younger people were more health conscious now. I nodded along, playing the part of the accommodating grandmother. Of course, dear, I suppose I'm just old-fashioned. But inside, I was taking notes. Mental notes about every condescending word, every dismissive glance, every moment she treated my son like her possession instead of her partner. Then her phone rang. She glanced at it and her face shifted, suddenly tense. She excused herself to take the call in the other room, and I heard her voice rise slightly. Something about the office, about her father, about not understanding why this was happening now. When she came back, she was visibly upset but trying to hide it. She told Daniel they needed to leave early, that there was some kind of emergency at her dad's company. She didn't elaborate, and Daniel didn't push, but I knew exactly what that call was about. It was Friday's termination notice finally hitting home. It was Robert realizing he couldn't hide my takeover from his daughter anymore. After they left, I sat in my quiet house and realized something. This wasn't over. Not even close. The real game was just beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, I played my role perfectly. When Daniel called to check on me, I was just asking about his work, suggesting he bring Vanessa by again soon, never mentioning Thornton Manufacturing. When I ran into Vanessa at the grocery store and, yes, even 74-year-old multimillionaires buy their own groceries, sometimes I was pleasant and bland, asking about married life and complimenting her outfit. She treated me exactly how she'd always treated me, like an inconvenient relic she had to tolerate for Daniel's sake. But I noticed things. She'd lost weight, the stress kind, where your face looks drawn. Her designer purse was last season's model, not the latest one she usually flaunted. And when she spoke, there was an edge to her voice that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. He looked troubled, and over coffee he finally told me what had been happening. Vanessa's father had some kind of investor dispute. The company was restructuring, and Vanessa had been let go from her consulting position. Daniel said she was devastated, that she'd been crying for days, that she kept saying someone was destroying her family. He asked me if I thought he should offer to help financially, maybe give Robert a loan or investment. I looked at my son, this good man who I'd raised to be generous and kind, and I did something that broke my heart. I lied to him. I told him that business investments between family members rarely worked out well, that he should let Robert handle his own affairs, that it was important for Vanessa to see her father navigate this independently. Daniel nodded, trusting my wisdom like he always had. After he left, I sat at my kitchen table and cried. Not from guilt, I'd made my choice, and I stood by it, but from the weight of it all. The weight of being the only one who knew the full truth. The weight of watching my son comfort a woman who'd called his mother a pig. The weight of 74 years of holding things together when they wanted to fall apart. But here's what I'd learned in those 7 decades. Sometimes love means making the hard choices that no one else can see. Sometimes protecting your family means letting them think you're just a harmless old woman making pot roast and giving questionable advice. Vanessa thought I was irrelevant. Robert thought I was just a silent investor. Even Daniel thought I was simply his elderly mother, well-meaning but out of touch. They had no idea I was the puppet master pulling every single string. 3 weeks after I took control of Thornton Manufacturing, Vanessa made her first real mistake. She underestimated me, one time too many, and this time, I was ready to use it. It happened at Daniel's birthday dinner. He'd turned 43, and I'd offered to host at my house, the same house where I'd raised him, where Kenneth and I had celebrated decades of birthdays and holidays. Vanessa had pushed back, suggesting a restaurant instead, but Daniel insisted. He said he wanted his birthday at home, with his mom's cooking. I made his favorite meal, pot roast, garlic mashed potatoes, and apple pie. The same menu I'd made for every birthday since he was old enough to choose. Some traditions matter, even when everything else is falling apart. Vanessa arrived late, dressed like she was going to a cocktail party instead of a family dinner. She air-kissed my cheek and immediately poured herself a large glass of wine from the bottle she'd brought expensive. She made sure to mention, from her father's private collection. During dinner, she drank steadily. By dessert, her polished veneer was cracking. "You know what's funny," she said suddenly, her words slightly slurred. "My father always said that Daniel's family was, what was the word he used? Comfortable. That's it. Comfortably middle class." She laughed, gesturing around my dining room. "I mean, this house is nice for what it is, but it's not exactly the lifestyle I grew up with." Daniel looked mortified. "Vanessa, that's not," she cut him off. "I'm just saying, it's an adjustment. Going from the Thornton name to ... this." She waved her hand vaguely at me. "No offense, Barbara, you're a sweet woman, but let's be honest about the difference in our family's positions." I smiled and cut another slice of pie. "None taken, dear." But Daniel wasn't smiling. I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped his fork. My son had finally started to see what I'd been seeing all along. Vanessa kept talking, emboldened by wine and her own sense of superiority. She started complaining about her father's company troubles, about how unfair it was that some anonymous investor had come in and started making changes. She said her father was a brilliant businessman being undermined by people who didn't understand manufacturing, who didn't respect legacy and tradition. "They even fired me," she said bitterly. "Can you believe that? After everything my family built, some faceless board decided I wasn't valuable enough to keep. Like I was just some random employee instead of a Thornton." I took a sip of water and asked, very gently, what her job responsibilities had been. She blinked at me, confused by the question. "I was a consultant, public relations, brand development, and what did that involve day to day?" She stumbled over her answer. Something about networking and maintaining the company image and being available for strategic discussions. It was clear, even to Daniel, that she'd done essentially nothing. That's when she made her biggest mistake of the evening. She looked at me with pity. Actual pity. Said that she hoped I'd taught Daniel better financial sense than to just coast on whatever his father had left behind. She said young people today needed to be ambitious, not content with inheritance. The assumption was clear. She thought I was living off Kenneth's money, doing nothing, contributing nothing. Just an old widow spending down her dead husband's savings. I could have told her the truth right then. Could have explained that Kenneth and I had built our fortune together, that I'd managed it alone for 6 years and nearly doubled it. Could have mentioned that I owned her father's company and had evidence of his systematic theft. Instead, I smiled and said that she was absolutely right, that young people should be ambitious. After they left, Daniel apologizing profusely. Vanessa, barely able to walk straight, I sat down at my computer and did something I'd been preparing for weeks. I pulled up every piece of documentation Philip had compiled, the wedding fraud, the consulting contracts, the Nevada LLC, all of it. Then I started building something new. A legal case. Airtight, comprehensive, the kind of case that wouldn't just win in court but would destroy any credibility Robert Thornton had left in the business community. But I wasn't ready to file it yet. That would be too easy, too quick. I needed more leverage first. Over the next month, I started making calls, quiet calls to old contacts, people Kenneth and I had done business with over the decades. I asked questions about Robert Thornton, about Thornton Manufacturing's reputation, about rumors they might have heard, and I listened carefully to what came back. Turns out, Robert's financial problems ran deeper than even I'd realized. He'd been using the company as collateral for personal loans all over town. He owed money to 3 different banks, had maxed out multiple lines of credit, and had been juggling payments for at least 2 years. The man was drowning in debt, held together only by the company I now owned. I also learned something interesting about Vanessa. Before she'd met Daniel, she'd been engaged to someone else, heir to a real estate fortune. That engagement had ended abruptly when the young man's family discovered she'd been stealing from him, small amounts at first, then larger ones. They'd paid her off quietly to avoid scandal, made her sign an NDA, and sent her packing. My son had no idea he'd married a woman with a history of theft. I hired a private investigator discreetly, through Philip's firm, to verify the story. Within 2 weeks, I had copies of the NDA bank records showing the payoff, and statements from the ex-fiancé's family attorney. Vanessa wasn't just entitled and cruel. She was a con artist who'd found her next mark in my generous, trusting son. That's when I knew this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about protecting Daniel from a woman who would eventually destroy him financially and emotionally. I made a new plan, more comprehensive, more devastating. I would dismantle the Thornton family's facade piece by piece until there was nothing left but truth. And then I would give my son the choice I should have given him from the beginning. Stay with a woman who married him for money and status, or walk away while he still could. They thought they were playing me, but I'd been playing this game since before they were born. The private investigator's report sat on my desk for 3 days before I could bring myself to read it completely. Not because I was afraid of what it contained, already suspected most of it, but because once I read it, once I knew everything, I'd have to decide what to do with that knowledge. And that decision would change my son's life forever. His name was Marcus Chen, the investigator. Philip had recommended him, said he was the best in the business for sensitive family matters. Marcus was thorough in a way that reminded me of Kenneth Matticlis, patient and completely factual. No embellishment, no speculation, just evidence. The report was 63 pages long. Vanessa Thornton, born Vanessa Marie Thornton in 1997, had lived exactly the life you'd expect from a spoiled manufacturing heiress. Private schools, luxury vacations, a sweet 16 party that cost more than most people's weddings. But around age 23, something shifted. She'd met a young man named Christopher Aldrich, whose family owned a commercial real estate empire in the Midwest. They'd gotten engaged within 6 months. The Aldrich family had been cautious, but ultimately welcomed her, seeing it as a good match between 2 business families. Then Vanessa had started accessing Christopher's accounts. First it was small, using his credit card for shopping, explaining it away as girlfriend privileges. Then it escalated. She'd convinced him to add her to one of his bank accounts for emergencies. Within 4 months, she'd transferred over $80,000 to her personal accounts, always in amounts just small enough to avoid immediate detection. Christopher's mother had caught it during a routine review of the family finances. They'd confronted Vanessa, who'd cried and claimed it was a misunderstanding, that she'd planned to pay it all back, that she'd been helping her father with a business emergency and was too embarrassed to ask directly. The Aldrich family hadn't bought it. They'd hired lawyers, recovered most of the money, and paid Vanessa an additional $50,000 to sign an NDA and disappear from their son's life. The family attorney's notes were clinical. Subject demonstrates pattern of financial manipulation and exploitation of romantic relationships. Strongly advised client family to ensure complete separation and no further contact. That had been 4 years ago. 2 years later, she'd met my Daniel. I sat in my office, the report spread across my desk, and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Genuine fear, not for myself, I could handle Vanessa and her father, but for my son, who I'd raised to see the best in people, who trusted easily, because he'd never had a reason not to. How much had Vanessa taken from him already? How much access did she have to his accounts, his assets, the trust fund Kenneth and I had set up for him? I called Philip immediately. It was 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, but he answered on the second ring. That's what decades of working together does. He knew if I was calling that late, it was urgent. I told him everything Marcus had found. Then, I asked the question that had been gnawing at me since the wedding. Philip, the prenup you drew up before Daniel married Vanessa, tell me it's solid. There was a pause, a long pause, too long. Barbara, he said carefully, Daniel didn't want to ask for a prenup. He said it felt unromantic, that it would imply he didn't trust Vanessa. I advised him strongly to reconsider, but ultimately, it was his choice. My blood ran cold. Are you telling me my son married this woman with no financial protection whatsoever? I drew up a prenup. He never presented it to her. Said he couldn't bring himself to do it, that it felt like starting the marriage with doubt. I closed my eyes. This was my fault. I'd raised him to be kind and trusting, and now that goodness was going to be used against him. How much access does she have to his money? I asked. Philip hesitated again. They opened a joint checking account after the wedding, for household expenses. I don't know how much he transferred into it. I knew my son. He was generous to a fault. That joint account probably had hundreds of thousands of dollars in it, maybe more. I need you to do something for me, I said. I need you to audit Daniel's finances without him knowing. Everything: bank accounts, investment accounts, credit cards, all of it. And I need you to do it fast. Philip agreed. Said he'd have preliminary information within 48 hours. I hung up and sat in the darkness of my office. Outside, the city lights glittered through my window. Kenneth and I used to sit here together, planning our next investment, talking about Daniel's future, dreaming about grandchildren we'd never gotten to meet. Kenneth had been gone 6 years, but I still found myself talking to him sometimes, usually when I needed his counsel, his steady presence. I don't know how to do this, I said to the empty room. If I tell Daniel everything right now, he'll be devastated. But if I wait, she might drain him dry. The silence didn't answer, but I knew what Kenneth would have said. He'd have told me to be strategic, to gather all my resources first, to make sure when I moved it was decisive and complete. So that's what I did. Philip called me back 36 hours later. His voice was tight. Barbara, you need to see this in person. I drove to his office immediately. Philip had documents spread across his conference table, bank statements, credit card bills, investment account summaries. He looked like he'd been up all night, and probably had been. Daniel opened that joint account with Vanessa the week after they got married, Philip said. He transferred $500,000 into it. For household expenses and wedding costs, he told his bank. $500,000. I felt sick. Over the past 3 months, Vanessa has withdrawn or transferred over $300,000 of it, most of it to accounts in her name, some of it to her father. Philip showed me the statements. Regular transfers, each one just under $10,000 to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts. She'd been systematic about it, careful. This wasn't impulsive shopping, this was planned theft. There's more, Philip said quietly. Daniel recently refinanced his house. He told the bank he wanted to help with his father-in-law's business troubles. He took out a $2 million line of credit against the property. Please tell me he didn't give that money to Robert Thornton. Not yet, but Vanessa has been pressuring him. I have emails. Daniel forwarded them to me asking for advice. She's telling him that her father's company is in crisis, that family helps family, that this is their chance to secure their future by investing in Thornton Manufacturing. The audacity of it took my breath away. Robert and Vanessa knew I owned the company. They knew I'd cut off their access to company funds, so they'd decided to drain my son instead. to manipulate him into giving them millions while making it sound like a smart investment. They were using Daniel's love for Vanessa and his generosity as a weapon against him. That's when I made my final decision. I'd been patient, strategic, careful. I'd gathered evidence and built my case, piece by piece. But my son was in immediate danger, and patience had its limits. "Philip," I said, my voice steady despite the fury burning in my chest, "I need you to prepare divorce papers. I need a forensic accountant to document every dollar Vanessa has stolen. And I need that report on Robert's fraud ready to file with the SEC and the IRS. We're done playing games." Philip nodded. "When do you want to move?" I looked at the calendar on his wall. It was early October. Daniel's birthday had been 3 weeks ago. Halloween was coming up, then Thanksgiving, then the holidays. 2 weeks, I said. "I'll talk to Daniel first, show him everything, then we execute. All of it at once." I drove home in the dark, my hand steady on the wheel, 74 years old, and I was about to go to war for my child the way I would have when he was a baby, the way any mother would. Vanessa had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd thought that being young and beautiful gave her power over an old woman like me. But she'd forgotten something important. I'd spent 50 years building an empire, and I would burn every dollar of it to the ground before I let someone hurt my son. The hardest conversation of my life happened on a Tuesday afternoon in my living room. Daniel had stopped by unexpectedly. He'd been doing that more often lately, I realized. Coming over without Vanessa, staying longer than necessary, finding excuses to talk. My son was drowning, and he didn't even know it yet. I made coffee the way he liked it, strong with just a touch of cream, and we sat across from each other in the same chairs where I'd read him bedtime stories 40 years ago. The afternoon light came through the windows, catching the silver in his hair. When had he gotten so much gray? When had my little boy turned into a middle-aged man who looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with work? "Mom," he said finally, "can I ask you something? About Dad?" My heart clenched. Daniel rarely brought up Kenneth, of course, sweetheart. "How did you know that he was the right one? That you could trust him completely?" I set down my coffee cup carefully. This was it. The opening I'd been waiting for, but also the moment I'd been dreading. "Your father and I trusted each other because we were honest with each other," I said slowly. "Even when the truth was hard, especially when the truth was hard." Daniel nodded, staring into his cup. "Vanessa and I had a fight last night, about money. She says I don't trust her because I won't invest in her father's company. She says if I really loved her, I'd help her family. And what do you think?" "I think ... double quotes." He paused, and I watched him struggle with disloyalty that came from honesty. "I think something feels wrong, Mom. She's changed since the wedding. Or maybe she hasn't changed, and I'm just finally seeing clearly." This was the moment. I could feel it in my bones, the way you feel where they're changing. I stood up and went to my office, returning with a folder. Not all of the folders. I wasn't cruel enough to destroy him all at once, but enough. "Daniel, I need to show you something, and I need you to promise me you'll look at everything before you react." His face went pale, but he nodded. I showed him the bank statements first, the joint account, the transfers, the systematic draining of $500,000. I watched his face as he processed it, saw the denial, then the anger, then the hurt. "She told me this was for household expenses," he whispered. "For furniture, for her student loans, for wedding vendors we still owed." "Keep reading," I said gently. I showed him the NDA from the Aldrich family, the investigator's report, the pattern of financial manipulation, everything. By the time he finished, my son was crying. Not loud, dramatic sobs, but quiet tears that broke my heart more than any sound could have. "How long have you known?" he asked. "About the Aldrich situation?" "A few weeks." "About the money she's been taking from you?" "Philip discovered it 3 days ago. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" This was the question I'd been asking myself for weeks, because I needed to be sure. Because I didn't want to be the interfering mother-in-law destroying your marriage over suspicions, and because I needed to have all the evidence ready before I put you in this position. He looked at me with eyes that reminded me so much of Kenneth. "What position, Mom?" "The position of having to choose between your wife and the truth." We sat in silence for a long time. Outside, I could hear children playing in a neighbor's yard, their laughter drifting through the windows. Normal life, continuing all around us while everything fell apart. Finally, Daniel spoke. "There's something else I need to tell you. Vanessa's pregnant. the world tilted. I gripped the arm of my chair, my elderly heart racing in my chest. She told me 2 days ago, Daniel continued. That's what the fight was really about. She said we need to invest in her father's company now, to secure our child's future. She said her family's business would be our child's legacy, a baby, a grandchild. The one thing Kenneth and I had dreamed of but never got to see, and Vanessa was using it as leverage. Are you sure she's actually pregnant? I heard myself ask. Daniel pulled out his phone and showed me a photo of a positive pregnancy test. But something about it looked off. The lighting was strange, the angle awkward. Has she been to a doctor? Have you seen ultrasound pictures? She has an appointment next week. She wanted to wait until after the first trimester to tell anyone else. How convenient. How perfectly timed for maximum manipulation. I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months ago. I called Philip right there, in front of Daniel, and put him on speaker. Philip, I need you to answer a question honestly. If someone were faking a pregnancy to manipulate their spouse financially, how long could they maintain that deception? There was a pause. Philip, bless him, didn't ask why. Depending on various factors, avoiding doctor's appointments together, using fake ultrasound images from the internet, claiming complications that require privacy, possibly several months, long enough to extract significant money. Daniel's face went gray. You think she's lying about being pregnant? I think, I said carefully, that we need to verify everything. No more taking anything on faith, no more trusting without proof. Over the next hour, I told Daniel everything. About owning Thornton Manufacturing. About Robert's fraud. About the wedding expenses and the consulting contracts and the systematic theft that had been happening for years. I watched my son's worldview shattered piece by piece. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that made me prouder than any business success ever could. What do we do, Mom? How do we fix this? Not how could you hide this from me, or why didn't you tell me sooner? Just, how do we fix this together? We give her enough rope to hang herself, I said. We let her think you're going to invest in her father's company. We set up the meeting, we let Robert and Vanessa think they've won, and then we reveal everything at once. The fraud, the theft, the manipulation, everything. And if she really is pregnant, then we deal with that reality with clear eyes. But Daniel, I need you to understand something. Even if there is a baby, you can't stay with someone who's been systematically stealing from you and lying to you. A child deserves better than to grow up watching that dynamic. My son nodded slowly. I could see him processing it all, his good heart warring with the evidence in front of him. When he asked finally, Friday, 3 days from now, I'll set up a meeting at Thornton Manufacturing, supposedly to discuss your investment. Robert and Vanessa will be there, thinking they're about to get $2 million from you. Instead, they're going to get the truth. Daniel left an hour later, his shoulders heavy with knowledge he couldn't unknow. I watched him drive away and felt the weight of every one of my 74 years. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the grandchild that might or might not exist, about how Vanessa had taken something sacred, the possibility of new life, and weaponized it. Around midnight, I got up and went to Kenneth's office. I'd kept it exactly as he'd left it, unable to change anything after he died. His books were still on the shelves, his reading glasses still on the desk. I sat in his chair and let myself cry for the first time since this whole thing began. Cried for my son's broken marriage. Cried for the family dinners that would never happen. Cried for the grandmother role I might never get to play, or might have to play under the worst possible circumstances. But when I finished crying, I dried my eyes and opened Kenneth's desk drawer. Inside was a letter he'd written me before he died, when he knew the cancer was winning. I'd read it 100 times, but I read it again now. Barbara, it said in his shaky handwriting, you've always been stronger than you believed. When I'm gone, don't let anyone, not society, not age, not fear make you small. You built this fortune alongside me. You earned every dollar. Use it to protect the people we love. Use it to fight back when fighting is necessary. And remember, kindness is important, but sometimes strength is love. Strength is love. I folded the letter and put it back in the drawer. Then I went to my computer and sent an email to Philip. Friday, at 2 p.m., Thornton Manufacturing Conference Room. Make sure the SEC investigator and the forensic accountant are ready. It's time. 3 days until the perfect moment. 3 days until I stopped being the patient grandmother and became the avenging angel my family needed. Vanessa and Robert had no idea what was coming. They thought they were meeting a generous son-in-law ready to hand over millions. Instead, they were about to meet a 74-year-old woman who'd spent 5 decades learning exactly how to destroy people who underestimated her. Friday arrived with crisp October air and absolute clarity of purpose. I woke up at 5 in the morning, the way I'd been waking up for 50 years of business dealings. My hands were steady as I dressed in my navy Chanel suit, the same one I'd worn for that first boardroom confrontation with Robert. Wore a uniform, Kenneth used to call it. Daniel had called me the night before, his voice tight with stress. He'd told me that Vanessa had been unusually affectionate all week, suddenly loving and attentive now that she thought the money was coming. She'd even scheduled a doctor's appointment for the following Monday to show him the baby. As she'd put it, the timing was perfect. Get the investment secured first, then provide proof of pregnancy after the money was already committed. My son's voice had cracked when he'd said that he'd been hoping, even after everything I'd shown him, that maybe there was some explanation, that maybe Vanessa had made mistakes but loved him genuinely, that maybe the pregnancy was real and they could work through everything else for the baby's sake. I'd told him something I'd learned over 7 decades. Hope is beautiful, but clarity is survival. And today, we'd have absolute clarity. Philip picked me up at 1:30. In the car, he briefed me on who would be in the room. Robert and Vanessa, obviously, Daniel, who was meeting us there, 2 witnesses from Philip's law firm, a forensic accountant named Sandra Mills who'd spent the past week documenting every fraudulent transaction, and an SEC investigator named James Whitmore who'd been very interested in the evidence we'd compiled about Robert's systematic theft. The Thornton manufacturing building looked exactly as it had the first time I'd walked in to confront Robert. Gray concrete, aging signage, a company living in the past. I walked through those doors with my briefcase in hand and my spine straight, feeling every one of my 74 years and grateful for every single one. Each year had taught me something. Each decade had given me weapons. The conference room was on the 3rd floor. Robert was already there, sitting at the head of the table like he still owned the place. Vanessa sat beside him, wearing a dress that probably cost $3,000 purchased, no doubt, with money she'd stolen from my son. When I walked in, she actually smiled at me, that condescending smile that said she thought she'd won. Daniel arrived, moments later, his face carefully neutral. He'd texted me earlier that morning, one word, ready. Robert stood up when he saw Daniel, his expression shifting into what he probably thought was gracious magnanimity. He started talking about how pleased he was that Daniel wanted to invest in the family business, how this would make them true partners, how their grandchild and, yes, he already knew about the supposed pregnancy would inherit a legacy built by both families working together. Vanessa reached for Daniel's hand across the table. She'd painted her nails a soft pink. I noticed, very maternal, very calculated. That's when Philip opened his briefcase, and the energy in the room changed completely. He started with the bank statements, laid them out one by one on the conference table, each page showing another transfer from the joint account Daniel had trusted his wife with. $300,000, moved systematically out of my son's account into hers, then into her father's, then into accounts that were supposed to be for investments but were actually personal expenses. Vanessa's smile faltered. She started to say something about how those were legitimate household expenses, how Daniel knew about all of it, how there must be some confusion. Philip didn't respond to her. He just kept laying out documents, the credit card statements showing luxury purchases, the evidence of transfers to Robert's personal accounts, the pattern of theft that had started the moment they'd returned from their honeymoon. Then came the investigator's report. Philip read sections aloud: the Aldrich family situation, the NDA, the payoff for stealing from her previous fiancé. He presented bank records showing the $50,000 Vanessa had received to go away quietly, money she'd never disclosed to Daniel when they were dating. I watched Vanessa's face cycle through emotions, shock that we knew, anger at being exposed, then calculation as she tried to figure out which lie would work now. She turned to Daniel with tears in her eyes and started telling him that the Aldrich situation was a misunderstanding, that his mother was trying to destroy their marriage because she'd never accepted her, that this was all a vendetta from a bitter old woman who couldn't let go of her son. Daniel looked at her with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, cold, distant, like he was looking at a stranger. Then Philip turned to Robert. This part I'd been waiting for. This part was mine. I stood up, slowly let them see the elderly woman rising from her chair. Let them underestimate me one last time, and I began to speak. I told Robert that I'd done a complete audit of Thornton Manufacturing since taking control, that I'd found the Nevada LLC and traced every payment, that I had documentation of nearly $1 million in systematic theft over 4 years, that I had evidence of tax evasion, fraud, embezzlement, and a dozen other charges that would send him to federal prison for a decade. Robert's face went from red to white to gray. He tried to bluster, started saying something about how I didn't understand business, how those were legitimate consulting fees, how he'd built that company and deserved compensation beyond his salary. I let him talk himself into a corner. Then I mentioned the Aspen property he'd purchased with company funds, the one that wasn't disclosed on any of his personal financial statements, the one that the IRS would be very interested to know about. That's when he realized I wasn't bluffing, that I had everything, that the harmless old woman he'd dismissed at his daughter's wedding was the person who now controlled his entire life. The second investigator introduced himself then, explained that based on the evidence Mrs. Sinclair had provided, there would be a formal investigation, that Robert should retain legal counsel, that there would likely be criminal charges. Vanessa's tears dried up instantly. She turned on her father, her voice rising as she demanded to know what he'd done, how he'd jeopardized their family, why he hadn't told her any of this. The performance was almost convincing the innocent daughter shocked by her father's crimes. That's when I played my final card. I pulled out the pregnancy test photo that Daniel had shown me. Then I pulled out 3 other images, identical photos found on a website that sold fake pregnancy test images for pranks. The photo Vanessa had sent to Daniel had been downloaded from the internet, the metadata still intact in the file properties. Sandra Mills, the forensic accountant, presented her findings. There were no medical bills in any of Vanessa's accounts, no prenatal vitamins purchased, no doctor's appointments scheduled in her name at any local practice. The appointments she'd claimed to have scheduled for Monday didn't exist. Vanessa's face crumbled. Not with shame, I'd seen enough liars to know the difference, but with fury at being caught. She started screaming then, calling me names I won't repeat, saying that I'd destroyed her life because I was a jealous old woman who couldn't stand to see her son happy with someone young and beautiful. Daniel stood up. He'd been silent through all of it, watching, absorbing. Now he pulled out divorce papers that Philip had prepared. He placed them on the table in front of Vanessa and told her that their marriage was over, that she had 24 hours to move out of his house, that if she contested anything, he would prosecute her for theft. His voice didn't shake. My boy had found his spine, and I'd never been more proud. Vanessa tried one more manipulation. She reached for Daniel's arm and told him she was sorry, that she'd made mistakes, but she loved him, that they could work through this together. She said she'd been under pressure from her father, that she'd been scared about money, that people do desperate things when they're afraid. Daniel pulled his arm away. He told her that if she'd actually loved him, she would have been honest, that love without honesty was just exploitation with better packaging. Then he walked out, just left, didn't look back. I gathered my briefcase and prepared to follow. Before I left, I looked at Robert Thornton one last time. This man who'd built his identity on his company, his legacy, his superiority over everyone around him. This man who'd raised a daughter to believe that being pretty and entitled was enough. This man who'd sat at his daughter's wedding and looked at me like I was invisible. I told him that he could resign as CEO effective immediately with a minimal severance, or he could stay and face criminal prosecution. That Thornton Manufacturing would survive without him. Had already identified a new CEO, someone competent and honest who'd actually earned their position. I told him that his daughter had destroyed my son's trust, stolen his money, and lied about carrying his grandchild, and that, as a mother, as a woman who'd spent 74 years watching men like him destroy things because they thought they were entitled to everything, I wanted him to know something important. I told him that every time he'd looked at me and seen an irrelevant old woman, every time his daughter had mocked my age or my weight or my supposed irrelevance, they'd made the same crucial mistake. They'd assumed that power looked like them. They'd forgotten that real power doesn't need to announce itself. It just waits and watches, and when the moment is right, it moves with absolute precision. Robert Thornton had spent 60 years building his empire on his family name and his masculine authority. It had taken me 3 months to buy it, and 3 minutes to destroy him. I walked out of that conference room and found Daniel standing in the hallway, staring out the window at the parking lot below. I stood beside him, and we watched Vanessa run to her car, crying dramatically, her phone already pressed to her ear. My son turned to me with tears in his eyes and thanked me. Not for the money, not for the company, not for any of it. He thanked me for loving him enough to tell him the truth when the truth would hurt. That's what 74 years teaches you, that love isn't always soft. Sometimes it's steel wrapped in grandmother's hands. Sometimes it's having the courage to break your child's heart so their life doesn't get destroyed. We drove home in silence. When we got to my house, Daniel came inside and we sat in the living room, where I'd shown him the evidence 4 days earlier. He told me he felt like an idiot for not seeing it sooner, for being so blind. I told him that con artists succeed because they target good people, that Vanessa had chosen him specifically because he was kind and generous and trusting, that his goodness wasn't weakness, it was what made him my son. As the sun set that evening, Daniel fell asleep on my couch, exhausted from the emotional devastation. I covered him with the Afghan I'd knitted 30 years ago and sat in my chair, watching him sleep the way I'd watched him sleep as a baby. This was what power was for. Not boardrooms or bank accounts. This, protecting the people you love with every resource at your disposal. Vanessa had called me a fat pig. Robert had dismissed me as irrelevant. They'd thought my age made me weak and my body made me invisible. They'd learned, too late, that grandmothers don't get to be grandmothers by being soft. We get there by being survivors, and we'll burn down anyone who threatens our children. 6 months have passed since that Friday afternoon in the Thornton manufacturing conference room. 6 months since I watched my son's marriage implode and his father-in-law's empire crumble. 6 months since I stopped being the invisible grandmother and became the woman who'd been there all along. The divorce was finalized in January. Vanessa fought it initially, tried to claim she deserved half of everything despite the prenup Daniel had never signed. But once her lawyer saw the evidence of theft and fraud, once they realized we had documentation of every stolen dollar and every manipulative lie, they advised her to take the settlement offer and disappear quietly. She did. Last I heard, she'd moved to Florida and was dating another wealthy man. I hope he's smarter than my son was. Robert Thornton resigned as CEO 3 days after our confrontation. The SEC investigation is still ongoing, but Philip tells me the evidence is so overwhelming that criminal charges are inevitable. The company itself is thriving under new management. Turns out that when you remove the corruption and nepotism, business actually runs quite efficiently. I'm planning to sell it within the year, once the value stabilizes. I bought it to save my son, not to run a manufacturing company in my 70s. Daniel moved back home with me for 2 months after the divorce, not because he needed to financially. He's a successful attorney with his own money, but because sometimes even 43-year-old men need their mothers. We had breakfast together every morning, and I watched him slowly piece himself back together. Watched him learn to trust his own judgment again. Watched him understand that being deceived doesn't make you stupid, it makes you human. He has his own place now, a condo downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city. He seems lighter somehow, like he'd been carrying weight he didn't know he was carrying. Last week he told me he started dating again, taking it slow, keeping his eyes open. He's learned that love requires wisdom, not just feeling. As for me, I'm still here in the house Kenneth and I bought 48 years ago, still making my morning coffee in the same kitchen, still sleeping on the same side of the bed even though Kenneth's side has been empty for 6 years. Some habits you keep because they're comfortable, and at 74, comfort matters, but I'm different too. I walk differently now, hold my head higher. I spent so many years after Kenneth died feeling invisible, feeling like society had decided I was finished just because I was old and widowed and didn't fit their image of what a woman should look like. Vanessa calling me a fat pig had hurt, but it had also awakened something I'd forgotten. I didn't need anyone's approval to take up space in this world. I've started teaching a business class at the local community college. Once a week, I talk to young people about venture capital and investment strategy and building wealth. Most of them are surprised when they see me walk in there expecting some young tech entrepreneur, not a 74-year-old grandmother in comfortable shoes. But by the end of the first lecture, they're taking notes like their lives depend on it. Because here's what I tell them. Age is the only wealth that everyone accumulates equally. You can be born poor or rich, brilliant or average, beautiful or plain, but everyone who lives long enough gets old. And the question isn't whether you'll whether you'll do it with dignity, with wisdom, with the knowledge that every year you survive makes you more valuable, not less. Last month, Daniel brought his new girlfriend to dinner. Her name is Rachel. She's 41, and she's a high school teacher with 2 kids from a previous marriage. She's not conventionally beautiful like Vanessa was. She's real laugh lines around her eyes, gray starting to show in her hair, the kind of comfortable presence that comes from having lived enough life to know what matters. She brought flowers and helped me with the dishes and asked questions about Kenneth because she understood that knowing someone's history is part of loving their family. When she left, she hugged me and thanked me for dinner, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope that my son had finally found someone worthy of him. I think about that wedding day sometimes, about standing at the buffet line in my expensive dress, hearing those cruel words, feeling that initial shock of being treated as less than because of my age and size, about how that moment could have destroyed me or diminished me. Instead, it reminded me who I was. It reminded me that I'd built an empire, raised a good man, survived losses that would have broken other people. It reminded me that power doesn't always look like youth and beauty and arrogance. Sometimes it looks like an old woman with silver hair and comfortable shoes who knows exactly when to strike. Vanessa thought she could dismiss me. Robert thought he could ignore me. They both learned that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimates. I'm 74 years old. I'm overweight by medical standards and old by society's standards and widowed by life standards. And I've never felt more powerful, more certain, or more proud of who I am. Because I learned something important these past months. Revenge isn't about destroying people who hurt you. It's about refusing to let their cruelty define your worth. It's about standing up and saying that you won't be invisible, you won't be dismissed, you won't be made small by people who think they're better than you. Kenneth would have loved this story. He always said I was stronger than I believed. I think I'm finally starting to agree with him. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever been dismissed because of your age or your appearance, or because someone assumed you were less than you, I'd love to hear from you. Drop your city in the comments below and let me know if you've ever had to remind someone not to underestimate you. And subscribe to hear more stories like mine, because every grandmother has battles she's fought and won. We're just better at fighting quietly. This old pig bought the whole damn farm, and I'm not apologizing for it.